In the winter of 1983, when the last snow fell over the small town of Haversham, a woman named Margaret Lorne found an old shoebox in the attic of her late husband's study. Inside were yellowed negatives, a few crumpled rolls of undeveloped film, and one photograph, carefully sleeved in glassine paper. She almost threw it away, but something about the image stopped her. It showed a train, an old British rail passenger line, framed from the platform. Through a fogged window, a young girl stared out, her face pressed lightly to the glass. The light caught her eyes in such a way that they seemed alive, both distant and pleading, as if frozen between motion and memory. Margaret sat down on the attic floor, the air thick with dust and silence. Her husband, Edward, had been a railway photographer for local newspapers back in the early 1960s. He'd taken hundreds of photographs, engines, stations, travelers, landscapes, but never people, never faces. Yet here, in the middle of the collection, was this, a portrait by accident. A fleeting moment. A girl on a train window. Margaret brushed a thumb over the faded border and turned the photo over. In Edward's careful handwriting, the date was written. March 12, 1963, northbound line. She frowned. The note beneath it read simply, "Do not publish." That evening, she left the photo on the kitchen table. The house was silent, a kind of silence that comes after too many years alone. The kettle whistled. The rain outside slid down the window in slow, wandering paths, like time retracing its own steps. When her daughter, Anne, visited 2 days later, she noticed the photograph at once. "It's haunting," she said quietly, studying the girl's blurred outline. "Do you know who she was?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I don't think he ever told me," and tilted the picture closer to the light. "It looks like she's looking right at him." Margaret hesitated. Edward used to travel that line often. He said once he saw something he could never forget. But I thought he meant an accident. There were so many back then. She folded her hands. He came home late that night, wet, pale. He didn't speak much for days. Later that week, Margaret brought the photograph to the local newspaper, the Haversham Gazette, where Edward had once worked. The editor, a man named Michael Renard, remembered him well. They sat in his small, cluttered office as he adjusted his glasses and looked at the picture. "This is one of Edward's?" "Yes," Margaret said softly. "I found it last week." Michael studied it for a long moment. "You know, there was a story around that time, something that made headlines for weeks." He opened a drawer, pulling out an old binder filled with clipped front pages from the early 60s. Turning page after page, he stopped at one. The date, March 13th, 1963. The headline, 14-year-old girl missing, last seen boarding northbound train. The grainy black and white image beside the headline made Margaret's breath catch. The missing girl's name was Clara Hill. Her photograph was formal, likely a school portrait. But the eyes, the angle of her chin, even the ribbon in her hair, it was her. The same girl from Edward's photograph. Michael sat back, silent for a long while. The hum of the radiator filled the room. "Edward took this the day before she disappeared?" Margaret shook her head. "The same day. The note says March 12th. She was reported missing that evening." He nodded slowly. "And he never showed this picture to anyone?" "No," Margaret said. "He never spoke of it. Not once." For the next few days, Margaret couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that face, trapped behind glass mid-motion, as though the train had never stopped. The next morning, she pulled a dusty box from Edward's desk drawer. Inside were rolls of undeveloped negatives, old letters, and receipts from the years he'd spent traveling the northern routes. Among them was a folded piece of stationery. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. "To the family of Clara Hill, I took a photograph that may belong to you. I don't know if it will bring comfort or pain, but it felt wrong to keep it. I saw her just before the train left. She looked lost, alone. I tried to call out, but the whistle blew. The letter was signed, but never sent." Margaret brought the photograph and letter to the local constable, hoping it might still mean something, even after 20 years. The man on duty, Sergeant Blake, listened carefully as she explained. He took the photo, turning it over in his hands. "We had dozens of missing persons back then," he said. "But this one, I remember my father talking about it. They never found her. Not a trace." He pulled a file from the archives, its edges yellowed with time. Inside were newspaper reports, witness statements, sketches of the train platform. The investigation had gone cold in 1965. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "She could have been alive, you think?" The sergeant looked at her kindly. "If this photo really shows her on that train, your husband may have been the last person to see her alive." The story quietly reached the Gazette. Michael published a small piece in the Sunday edition. "Unseen photograph may shed light on 1963 disappearance." It wasn't sensational. Just a few paragraphs, and a reproduction of the image. The girl's face soft, indistinct, as though time itself refused to clarify it. 2 days later, the newspaper received a letter addressed in neat handwriting. It read, "The girl in the window was my sister. We never knew what happened to her. Please tell me who took the photograph." The letter was signed, L. Hill. Michael contacted Margaret immediately. They met in the paper's archive room, the smell of ink and old paper thick in the air. "Her brother wrote this," he said quietly. "He lives in Dover now. He wants to meet." Margaret hesitated, fingers brushing the edge of the photo once more. "I don't know if I can face him," she said. "Edward's gone. I don't even know why he kept it." Michael looked at her. Maybe he kept it because he couldn't forget. When they met, Lawrence Hill was in his 50s, a quiet man with the tired look of someone who had carried too many questions for too long. He held the photograph gently, as though afraid it might dissolve. "That's her," he whispered. "Clara. She used to lean her head against the window like that when she was thinking, always staring out at things she couldn't reach." He looked up. "Your husband, he saw her that day?" Margaret nodded. "He was on assignment, photographing the new station line. He told me later something had gone wrong, that he'd missed a shot he'd meant to take. I never asked what he meant." Lawrence sat back. "My parents died never knowing. She'd gone into town for a school outing, never came back. Some said she ran away. Others, well," he paused. "But this photo, this means she was alive when the train left. That's more than we ever knew." That night, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Edward, about the guilt that seemed to shadow him after that year. He'd stopped traveling soon after, stopped taking photographs altogether. He'd taken up gardening. He rarely left home. And when he died, he left no notes, no confessions, only silence. Yet the more she stared at the photograph, the more she began to see something she hadn't noticed before. In the reflection of the glass, faint, almost invisible, there was another figure, a man's silhouette, standing on the platform, camera in hand. Edward. It wasn't just a picture of Clara Hill. It was a picture with him in it. The next day, Margaret returned to the Gazette and showed the editor what she'd found. Michael enlarged the photograph in the darkroom, careful not to damage the print. Under red light, the details emerged. And there it was, the unmistakable outline of Edward's trench coat, blurred by motion, reflected in the glass beside the girl's face. He wasn't just a witness. He was part of the moment, captured by his own lens. Michael leaned closer. "You said he came home late that night?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. "And his shoes were wet. He said he missed the last train back." She looked at the photograph again. "But maybe he didn't." That night, Margaret sat by the window, listening to the faint whistle of a distant train. It sounded exactly as it had all those years ago. She held the photo in her lap, feeling the cold glass against her palms. For 20 years, her husband had carried this memory, silent, unresolved. Whatever he saw that day, it had followed him until the end. And now, as she watched the reflection of her own face in the windowpane, she finally understood what haunted him. He had captured a moment that wasn't meant to be captured. A girl on the verge of vanishing. A life caught between motion and disappearance. In the days that followed, Margaret received a letter from Lawrence Hill. "Thank you for showing me the photograph. It doesn't give us answers, but it gives us something else. Proof she existed that day. Proof she was seen. He enclosed a small photograph of his own, a family picture from 1962. Clara sitting between her parents, smiling. The same ribbon in her hair. Margaret placed the two photographs side by side on the mantel. One still, one moving. The living and the lost, frozen together in glass and grain. In the spring of 1983, the Haversham Gazette published a follow-up. Readers remembered the story. Some claimed they'd seen the girl that day. Others swore she'd spoken to them at the platform before the train left. But no new evidence emerged. Only memories, half faded, half true. And yet, something in the town changed. The photograph, reprinted in the paper, hung in the waiting room of the old station. Commuters passed it each morning, often pausing to look, just for a moment, before their trains arrived. They said the girl's eyes followed you, that if you stood still enough you could almost hear the whistle. In the quiet of her home, Margaret placed the original photograph back in its glassine sleeve. She sealed it in an envelope and wrote on the front, "To be opened when someone still remembers her." Then she set it in the drawer beside Edward's wedding ring and turned off the light. Outside, a freight train passed through the valley. The sound faded into distance, a single note dissolving into silence. And in that silence, the image remained. A girl on a train window, looking out, neither gone nor found, only remembered. By the time spring reached Haversham, the story of the girl in the train window had spread far beyond the town. The Gazette's modest article had found its way into regional papers, and one of those papers, the Midland Chronicle, passed across the desk of a freelance journalist named Thomas Reed. He wasn't looking for mysteries. Not anymore. But something about that headline, "Unseen Photograph May Shed Light on 1963 Disappearance," drew him in. He had covered missing person cases before. Most ended in silence, some in heartbreak, but rarely did one begin with a photograph. A photograph that had waited 20 years to speak. Thomas arrived in Haversham 2 weeks later, carrying a worn satchel, a notebook, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing that truth never reveals itself quickly. He met with Michael Renard at the Gazette office, a building that still smelled faintly of ink and tobacco. "You're the journalist from the Chronicle?" Michael asked, shaking his hand. "Yes," Thomas replied, "but not on assignment. I just want to understand what this photograph really shows." Michael nodded, motioning toward a small drawer. "Then you'd better see it for yourself." He laid the print on the table under the soft yellow light. The girl's face, the blurred reflection, the faint outline of Edward Lorne's camera. Thomas leaned closer. The glass distortion almost gave the impression of motion, as if the train still moved beneath his gaze. "Where was this taken?" he asked quietly. "Platform 3, Michael said. "Northbound line. March 12, 1963. "And the photographer?" "Edward Lorne, local man. Died last year. His widow found it in his attic." Thomas took a breath. "Do you know why he wrote 'Do not publish'?" Michael hesitated. "No one does. But his wife said he came home that night shaken. Whatever he saw that day, it stayed with him." That night, Thomas stayed at the small inn across from the station. From his window, he could see the very platform where the photograph had been taken. It hadn't changed much. The same worn benches, the same iron lamps that flickered in the mist. Only the trains were different now, faster, louder, less human somehow. He imagined the moment as it must have been in 1963. The hiss of steam, the metallic scent of rain on iron, and a girl pressing her face to the glass, as if caught between two worlds. He jotted a note in his book. Sometimes, a photograph is not about what it shows, but what it hides. The next morning, Thomas met with Lawrence Hill, Clara's brother. They sat in a quiet cafe by the station. The air smelled of coffee and old varnish. "She was 14, Lawrence said, eyes fixed on the tabletop. Bright, restless, the kind of girl who never felt she belonged in a small town. He pulled a folded page from his coat pocket, a copy of the missing person notice from 1963. Last seen at Haversham Station, Platform 3, approximately 3:40 p.m. She was supposed to be coming home from a school trip, he continued, but she never got off the train. No one remembered seeing her board either. The police thought she might have run away. Thomas studied the old photo beside the notice. The resemblance was beyond doubt. She wasn't running away, he said quietly. At least not from what I see here. Lawrence looked up. What do you mean? Her face, Thomas said. There's no fear, just thought. She looks like someone leaving something behind, not fleeing from it. Later that day, Thomas visited the county archives. Dust clung to every surface. The clerk, an elderly man with thick spectacles, helped him search the 1963 railway records. Train 12B, the northbound service from Haversham, had departed at 3:42 p.m. and arrived in Casterfield at 6:09. No incidents reported. But one small note caught Thomas's attention in the conductor's log. Unaccompanied minor in compartment 4. Ticket purchased cash. Destination, unknown. He traced his finger down the entry. No name, no signature. Just that small detail, forgotten, unremarkable. Do you have the conductor's name? Thomas asked. The clerk checked the old ledger. It says R. Finch. Retired, I think. Might still live near the coast. Thomas made a note. That evening, he returned to the Gazette to copy Edward Lorne's contact records. Letters, notes, receipts. Among them, he found a half-finished roll of negatives from the same day. The frames before the famous photograph showed nothing unusual. A station sign, a blurred train door, a child's dropped glove. But the final image, the one after the girl's photograph, was almost blank. Overexposed. Only a faint outline appeared in the light. A dark figure standing near the edge of the platform, looking toward the departing train. A shadow, elongated, distorted. Could have been anyone, or no one, but something about it unsettled him. He turned the print toward Michael. Could that be Edward? Michael shrugged. Possibly, but why take another shot? He'd already captured her. Thomas nodded slowly. Unless he was trying to capture something else. The next day, Thomas drove 2 hours to the coast to find Richard Finch, the retired conductor. He found him in a small seaside cottage, surrounded by stacks of old timetables and railway memorabilia. When Thomas mentioned the date, Finch's expression changed. I remember that day, he said after a pause. Not the girl exactly, but something odd happened on that run. He reached for a worn notebook. A man boarded last minute, said he was a photographer for the Gazette, had a camera bag, sat near the girl in compartment 4. They didn't speak much, but I remember she kept glancing toward him. He looked nervous, kept checking his watch. Thomas felt a slow chill move through him. Did he get off before the next stop? Finch frowned. No, he stayed on until Larchfield. Got off in a hurry. The girl stayed on. When we reached Casterfield, her seat was empty. Empty? Finch nodded. Her luggage was gone. I assumed she disembarked earlier. But there was no record. Driving back that evening, the rain began. Slow at first, then steady. The wipers moved in rhythm with his thoughts. Edward Lorne had been on that train. Not at the platform, on the train. He had seen Clara Hill up close. Maybe even spoken to her. And whatever happened after that, he had buried it under silence. Thomas returned to Haversham and visited Margaret once more. She seemed older now, though only a week had passed. I found someone, he said gently. A conductor who remembers Edward being on that train. Margaret's eyes widened. On it? He told me he'd missed it. I don't think he did. He laid the notes on the table. He was seen sitting near her compartment. She covered her mouth. But why would he lie? Thomas hesitated. I don't think it was guilt of crime, Mrs. Lorne. I think it was guilt of memory. She looked at him. You mean, something happened, and he couldn't stop it? Maybe, Thomas said softly. Or maybe he tried. That night, Margaret searched her husband's study again. She opened drawers, flipped through old notebooks, until she found something taped to the back of a frame. A small envelope, sealed with fading wax. Inside was a single strip of negative film and a note. If ever found, know that I tried to bring her home. The film showed 3 frames. First, Clara's reflection in the window. Second, Edward's silhouette in the glass. Third, a blurred countryside, as if the camera had fallen. Thomas studied the sequence carefully. The timing suggested something sudden, motion, perhaps. A stumble. A door opening mid-travel. He felt his chest tighten. Maybe, he whispered. He saw her fall. The next morning, Thomas took the negatives to a specialist in Casterfield. Under magnification, faint details emerged in the final frame. Streaks of iron, gravel, and what looked like part of a scarf caught in motion. A red scarf. In Clara's school photo, she had worn one. He sat in silence. There were no police reports of a fall, no body found along the route. Perhaps she had fallen where no one looked. Or perhaps Edward had searched and never found her. He thought of the unsent letter Margaret had found, the one addressed to the Hill family. I saw her, just before the train left. She looked lost, alone. I tried to call out, but the whistle blew. Now those words felt heavier, not a description but a confession. When Thomas returned to Haversham, he brought the restored negatives with him. He showed them to Margaret first. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering, "He never told me. All those years. He never said." And then to Lawrence Hill, who wept quietly as he studied the blurred countryside in the final frame. "She didn't run away," Lawrence said at last. "She never even made it." Thomas nodded. "I think Edward tried to help her. Maybe she panicked. Maybe she wanted to jump off to turn back. He might have reached for her and missed." Lawrence closed his eyes. "That's why he never spoke." He carried it with him. For the Gazette's anniversary issue, Michael Renard asked Thomas to write the story. Not sensationally, not as a mystery, but as a remembrance. Thomas agreed. The article was simple, factual, respectful. It told of a photographer, a missing girl, and a single image that had waited 20 years to speak its truth. The closing line read, "Sometimes, the camera remembers what the heart cannot bear to." When the story ran, readers sent letters from across the country. Strangers who'd once known Clara, or Edward, or who'd simply been moved by the photograph. One letter stood out, and signed, typed neatly, said only, "She was trying to go home. He tried to stop her. I saw them, from the next compartment." No address, no name, just that. Thomas placed the letter in his notebook, beside the photograph, and sat in the empty station cafe. Outside, an evening train slowed into the platform, its windows glowing amber in the dusk. For a moment, through the fogged glass, he thought he saw her again, the outline of a girl, leaning toward the light. But when the train pulled away, there was nothing there. Only reflection. Only the quiet hum of a story finally finding its way to the surface. That night, as the rain began again, Thomas wrote one last note in his journal. Truth isn't always what we uncover. Sometimes, it's what we choose to remember. And somewhere in the old Gazette archives, beneath the headline clippings and railway logs, the photograph waited, its edges curling, its silver fading, but its gaze eternal. The girl on the train window. The moment that never stopped moving. Autumn arrived early that year. By late September, Haversham Station was wrapped in thin mist, and the morning trains passed like ghosts across the valley. The story of the girl in the train window had reached its end, at least in the public's eyes. But for Thomas Reed, something still lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, that the photograph hadn't finished speaking. There was the unsigned letter. The line, "She was trying to go home." He tried to stop her. It haunted him, not because it changed the story, but because it suggested someone else had been there. Someone who'd seen what Edward couldn't bear to remember. 2 months later, Margaret Lorne called him. Her voice trembled softly over the line. "Mr. Reed, I found something." He drove down that same evening. The sun had already set, and the streets were washed in a pale amber light. Margaret waited by the hearth, holding a small wooden box. "I was clearing Edward's desk," she said, and I found this sealed beneath the drawer. The box was simple, polished oak, brass clasp. Inside, a single envelope and a roll of exposed film. The envelope was addressed, in Edward's hand, "For Margaret, if ever the truth can bring peace." She couldn't bring herself to open it. Thomas read the words aloud, then looked at her. "Would you like me to read it?" She nodded. He unfolded the letter carefully, the paper thin as breath. The handwriting was deliberate, precise, the way people wrote when words cost effort. March 1982. My dearest Margaret, I have tried to forget that day for 20 years. But memory has a way of living on in light, in the silver of film, in the flash of the mind when you close your eyes. I was on that train, Margaret. I told you I wasn't, but I was. I had boarded at the last minute to capture a photograph from the northern fields. That was my assignment, the new carriages, the faces of travel, the return to normal life. But she was there. The girl, Clara. She sat alone. No luggage but a small satchel and a red scarf. She reminded me of someone I once knew. My sister, before she died during the war. The same way of looking out the window, as if the world outside could answer something the world inside never would. We spoke briefly. She said she was heading north, but her voice trembled. When I asked if her family knew, she looked away. She said she only wanted to go home. I didn't understand what she meant. When the train slowed after the viaduct, she stood, clutching her scarf. I thought she was reaching for her bag, but she was reaching for the door. She stepped into the aisle. I tried to stop her. God knows I tried. The latch gave way in the wind. I caught her sleeve, but she slipped free. The scarf tore from her neck and vanished into the night. I pulled the emergency cord, but by the time the train stopped, she was gone. I searched the embankment, called her name. Nothing. Only the sound of the river below. I told the conductor she'd disembarked early. I lied. I couldn't bear to be the man who saw it and failed. When I developed the photographs, one frame showed her through the window, alive, just before it happened. I couldn't destroy it. It was proof that she'd existed, if only for that moment. Proof that she wasn't forgotten. I sent a letter to her family, but I never posted it. I thought silence was kinder than truth. If this letter finds you, it means my silence has lasted too long. I've spent my life asking whether one photograph can forgive a moment. I know now it cannot, but perhaps it can remember what I could not save. Yours always, Edward. When Thomas finished reading, the room was silent. Margaret sat motionless, her eyes glistening but calm. I knew he carried something, she whispered, but I didn't know it was this. She reached into the box and lifted the small roll of film. Do you think it still holds anything? I can have it developed, Thomas said softly. Carefully. A week later, the prints came back. 6 frames in total. The first, the familiar photograph of the girl at the window. The second, Edward's faint reflection. The third, blurred countryside, the fall. The fourth, darkness streaked by motion. The fifth, a riverbank distant and out of focus. And the sixth, a piece of fabric tangled among reeds. A red scarf. Thomas brought the prints back to Margaret. She studied them quietly, her hand trembling as she traced the outline of the scarf. He never stopped searching, she said, even after all these years. No, Thomas replied. He just searched in silence. She placed the photograph beside the letter and sighed. He once told me that photographs were about what people leave behind. I thought he meant art. Now I think he meant regret. The next day, Thomas drove to Casterfield, the last recorded stop of the northbound line. The railway still cut through the same hills, the same river curve where the accident might have happened. He walked along the embankment until he reached the old viaduct. There, beneath the bridge, the river moved slow and silver, carrying leaves and fragments of light. And there, snagged among the roots of a tree, he saw it. A scrap of faded fabric, barely the size of a ribbon. It might have been nothing, or it might have been hers. He didn't take it. He simply stood there, letting the sound of the river fill the silence between then and now. Back in Haversham, the Gazette prepared a memorial feature, not of mystery, but of remembrance. The story was told one last time, with Margaret's permission, using Edward's letter as its heart. Thomas wrote it simply. The photograph was not evidence of guilt, but of witness. A man who saw what others missed. A girl who looked toward home and never arrived. And a single moment of light that outlasted both. When the article ran, readers sent flowers to the station. Someone pinned a red ribbon to the bench on platform 3. Another left a note that said, "For Clara, still on the journey." That winter, Margaret visited the station every few weeks. She never boarded the trains. She simply stood by the platform, watching them pass. Their windows filled with the faces of strangers and ghosts. Once, she noticed a reflection in the glass, her own, blurred and distant, and thought how similar it looked to the photograph Edward had taken. For the first time, she didn't feel haunted by it. She felt seen. Months later, Thomas compiled the entire story, the photographs, the letters, the testimonies, into a small feature book. He titled it The Girl on the Train Window. He wrote in the preface, "We live in fragments of other people's memories. Sometimes we only see them for a moment, through glass, through time, through loss, and then they're gone. But if we remember them, even once, they're never truly lost." The book sold modestly, but in homes across England it found quiet shelves, in attics, in libraries, beside old family albums. And somewhere in one of those homes, a reader, perhaps a daughter, perhaps a stranger, looked at that photograph and whispered, "She looks so alive." Years passed. The station modernized. The benches were replaced. The old lamps removed. Only one thing remained, a small framed copy of the photograph that hung near the ticket office. It bore a simple inscription, "In memory of those who vanished, and those who remembered." Every now and then, travelers would pause before it, drawn by something they couldn't name. Some said the girl seemed to change, that in certain light she almost smiled. Others claimed to see a faint reflection beside her, like the outline of a man reaching forward, forever trying to hold on. By 1990, Margaret had grown frail. One evening, she called Thomas to her home. "I wanted you to have this," she said, handing him the original photograph, now framed in oak. "You gave it meaning again." Thomas hesitated. "Are you sure?" She smiled faintly. "It doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to memory." As he left, she looked out the window, the distant train lights shimmering beyond the fields. She whispered something only the dark could hear. Perhaps Edward's name. Perhaps Clara's. Perhaps both. Thomas never forgot that night. Years later, after Margaret passed away, he returned the photograph to the Haversham Historical Society, where it still hangs today. Under soft museum light, its surface cracked slightly with age. And if you stand close enough, you can still see it. The reflection of a man holding a camera. The faint glimmer of a red scarf. And a girl looking outward. Not trapped, not lost, just remembered. Some say the photograph solved the mystery. But Thomas knew better. It didn't solve it. It understood it. It revealed that loss is not measured by what disappears, but by what endures, the small acts of witness that keep memory alive. A man trying to save a stranger. A woman keeping his secret safe. A journalist listening to their silence. And a girl on a train window, forever caught between leaving and home.